The wind howled over the frozen tundra, sweeping across the endless expanse of ice and snow. The Arctic was a land of breathtaking beauty and deadly isolation, where only the strongest survived. The northern lights flickered across the sky like eerie green ghosts, casting an otherworldly glow over the desolate landscape. But tonight, something was terribly wrong. A distress call had come in from a remote research station off the coast of Canada's icy north. A lone polar bear had been spotted wandering the shoreline, moving sluggishly, its massive body weighed down by something unnatural. At first, the scientists thought it was simply malnourished, a heartbreaking yet increasingly common sight as climate change pushed Arctic predators to the brink. But when they zoomed in with their high-powered binoculars, what they saw sent a chill down their spines. The bear's fur was matted and patchy, its once powerful limbs weakened, and covering its thick white coat were strange, dark shapes, clinging to its body like a parasitic plague. Barnacles. That should have been impossible. Barnacles only attached to rocks, shipwrecks, and the backs of whales that spent their lives in the sea. But this bear, a creature of the land, had somehow become infested. The hardened shells of the barnacles dug deep into its skin, dragging it down, causing sores and infections that threatened its life. It was a horrifying mystery, one that needed to be solved before the bear succumbed to its suffering. A team of wildlife rescuers was called in, led by veteran Arctic conservationist Dr. Evelyn Carter. She had spent decades studying polar bears, tracking their movements, and fighting for their survival. But she had never seen anything like this. With her were two experienced field experts, Liam Park, a fearless marine biologist with a passion for uncovering oceanic mysteries, and Jonah Reed, a skilled veterinarian specializing in large predators. Together, they had faced extreme Arctic conditions before, but this mission would be unlike any other. Time was running out. The bear's movements were growing weaker, and the longer it suffered, the greater the risk that it would perish before they could reach it. Worse still, no one knew how aggressive it might become in its desperation. A full-grown male polar bear could weigh over 1,500 pounds and take down a walrus with ease. If the pain and distress made it lash out, the team would be in serious danger. As they loaded their supplies into the helicopter, the questions kept piling up. How had this happened? Was this a freak occurrence, or was something far more sinister at play? And most importantly, could they save this bear before it was too late? The roar of the helicopter blades filled the air as they lifted off into the Arctic night, racing toward the unknown. What they would find out there in the frozen wasteland would change everything they thought they knew about the world's most powerful predator and the hidden dangers lurking beneath the ice. The helicopter cut through the bitter Arctic air, its powerful blades slicing through the silence of the frozen wilderness. Inside the cockpit, Dr. Evelyn Carter sat rigid, her gloved hands gripping the straps of her harness as she stared out at the vast expanse of ice and ocean beneath them. The Arctic had always been a place of mystery, a land that revealed its secrets only in whispers. But tonight, something felt different, something felt wrong. She had spent the last 20 years tracking and studying polar bears, but nothing in her research, nothing in her decades of experience, had prepared her for the sight of a land-dwelling predator covered in barnacles. It defied logic, biology, and every rule of nature she had ever known. And that terrified her more than the bitter cold that seeped through the thick layers of her insulated suit. Liam Park sat beside her, hunched over a tablet, scanning through recent satellite images of the region. His sharp eyes flicked between different heat signatures, clusters of seals huddled on the ice, the occasional movement of a migrating pod of orcas, but nothing that could explain how a fully grown polar bear had become infested with creatures that only attached to marine life. He had seen barnacle growth on whales, sea turtles, even abandoned ships, but a polar bear? That was new, and not the kind of new he liked. His background in marine biology meant he had encountered some of the ocean's strangest anomalies, but every logical explanation he formulated crumbled under the weight of reality. He glanced at Evelyn, her expression unreadable, but he could see it in her eyes, the same gnawing unease that had been twisting his stomach since they received the call. Jonah Reed, sitting behind them, was checking and rechecking his medical equipment. His job was to sedate the bear if necessary, treat any wounds, and assess its condition. But he knew the real danger wasn't just the bear itself. There was something unnatural about this situation, and whatever had caused it might not be isolated to a single animal. He had seen firsthand the devastating effects of pollution, disease outbreaks, and the way human interference had disrupted fragile ecosystems. But this wasn't like that. This felt deliberate, intentional. But by who? And why? As the helicopter neared the last reported sighting of the bear, Jonah's thoughts drifted back to their last expedition, a mission in early winter, just weeks ago, when they had responded to another unusual case. A different bear had been found near the remains of an abandoned research outpost, its body weak, its fur discolored. At the time, they had assumed it was simply a case of starvation, a tragic but increasingly common occurrence as ice melted and food sources became scarce. But now looking back, the similarities gnawed at him. That bear had been alone, far from its usual hunting grounds, its body marked with strange abrasions. They had performed a full examination, taken samples, but before they could gather more data, the bear had disappeared into the storm. Evelyn had argued to stay longer, to dig deeper, but the brutal weather had forced them to retreat. Now she wondered if they had missed something, if they had left too soon. Was that bear the first victim of whatever was happening now? The radio crackled, breaking through her thoughts. The voice of the research station's lead scientist, Dr. Marcus Bell, came through tense and hurried. The bear is moving inland. Slowly? It looks bad, Evelyn. Worse than before. It keeps stopping, like something is weighing it down. You need to get here fast. Evelyn's pulse quickened. If the bear was still moving, that meant they had a chance to help it. But why was it heading inland? Polar bears rarely strayed too far from the ice, unless they were sick, starving, or running from something. Copy that, Marcus, she responded, her voice steadier than she felt. We're almost there. She exchanged a look with Liam, who had already started scanning the coastline for any signs of movement. The northern lights shimmered above them, casting a greenish glow over the frozen wasteland. But below, the world was eerily still. No seals, no signs of life, just miles of ice, stretching endlessly into the dark horizon. And then, movement. Got it, Liam muttered, zooming in on the heat signature. That's our bear. The animal was barely recognizable as the apex predator it was supposed to be. Its once powerful body looked frail, its massive frame, hunched under the unnatural weight of the barnacles that clung to its fur like tumors. The thick ice around its legs cracked under its slow, lumbering steps, and with every agonizing movement, it seemed to struggle to keep itself upright. Jonah exhaled sharply, shaking his head. This isn't just an infestation. This bear is dying. Evelyn swallowed hard. The thought had been gnawing at her since they first received the report, but now, seeing it with her own eyes, the full weight of it hit her. And yet, something didn't add up. The barnacles shouldn't be able to attach to a polar bear at all. Their larvae needed specific conditions to survive, and even if the bear had somehow been in the water long enough for them to latch on, they wouldn't have grown this fast, not like this. This wasn't normal. It wasn't natural. Liam suddenly tensed, his fingers tapping against the screen of his tablet. There's something else, he muttered. Evelyn leaned closer. What? Liam adjusted the thermal imaging. The bear was there, struggling across the ice. But a few hundred feet away, partially obscured by a ridge of snow, something else. Another heat signature. Something watching. Her breath caught in her throat. They weren't alone out here. And whatever was hiding in the shadows had been there long before they arrived. The helicopter descended slowly, its floodlights slicing through the darkness as they hovered above the ice. Below, the polar bear still moved sluggishly, its massive form barely able to support its own weight. But Evelyn's eyes were locked onto something else, the strange, distant heat signature Liam had spotted. It wasn't the bear. It was something or someone watching from the shadows. Jonah clenched his jaw as he adjusted his binoculars, scanning the landscape. The Arctic was vast, empty, and unforgiving, but out here, in the dead of night, nothing should have been moving except for them and the bear. Yet there it was, an unmistakable presence, hidden just beyond the ridgeline. The shape was human-sized, but unmoving, almost as if it was lying in wait. A hunter? A researcher? Or something else entirely? Evelyn forced herself to stay calm. There was no room for panic. "Liam, keep an eye on it," she ordered. "Jonah, get ready. We're bringing this bear in." The helicopter touched down a safe distance away, and the team moved quickly, stepping out onto the frozen terrain, their breath curling into the frigid air. The ice beneath their boots groaned in protest, a constant reminder of how unstable this world had become. Jonah prepped the tranquilizer gun, his fingers steady despite the tension crackling in the air. The bear, weakened and struggling, barely reacted as they approached. It should have noticed them. It should have been aggressive, or at least defensive, but instead, it barely lifted its head. Something was very wrong. As they drew closer, the full horror of its condition became clear. The barnacles weren't just attached to the bear's fur, they were embedded in its skin. Deep, raw lesions surrounded each hardened shell, oozing infection. Some had clustered around its face, near its eyes, distorting its vision. The weight of them pulled at its body, as if something had tried to drag it down, to keep it submerged long enough for these parasites to take hold. Jonah swore under his breath. This doesn't make sense. Barnacles don't grow this fast. Not on land. Not like this. Evelyn crouched beside the bear, her heart pounding. She had seen sick animals before. She had witnessed the devastating effects of starvation, disease, and injury. But never had she encountered something that should not be possible. And then, from behind them, Liam's voice low and urgent. "The heat signature is gone." Evelyn turned sharply. "What?" "It was right there," Liam insisted, his breath clouding in the cold air. "But now it's gone." Jonah glanced toward the ridgeline, his grip tightening around the tranquilizer gun. "We're not alone out here." A sudden gust of wind howled across the ice, rattling their gear, as if the Arctic itself wanted them gone. The unease gnawed at Evelyn's gut, but she forced herself to focus. They didn't have time to worry about ghosts in the snow, not when they had a dying bear in front of them. Jonah raised the tranquilizer gun and fired. The dart embedded into the bear's shoulder, and within seconds, its heavy breathing slowed. It wasn't unconscious yet, but it was sedated enough for them to work quickly. Evelyn pulled out her scalpel, ready to take a sample from one of the barnacle clusters. But the moment she touched the hardened shell, a sharp crack echoed through the night. The barnacle moved. Evelyn jerked her hand back, horror creeping up her spine. The shell split open slightly, revealing something alive writhing inside. It wasn't a normal barnacle. It wasn't even something she recognized. Jonah saw it too. "What the hell is that?" Liam knelt beside them, snapping a quick photo with his tablet before zooming in on the grotesque parasite. It looked wrong, like a hybrid between a barnacle and something else entirely, its inner tendrils shifting, as if sensing their presence. It was growing, feeding, spreading. And then, the sound. A distant crunch of snow. All three of them froze. The ridgeline. Something was out there. Evelyn stood slowly, scanning the darkness, her pulse hammering in her ears. Liam grabbed the thermal scanner again, sweeping it across the landscape. Nothing. Whatever had been watching them had vanished without a trace. But then, as if in response, the bear let out a deep, pained groan, its body twitching. The parasite inside the barnacle quivered, as if reacting to the sound. Jonah grabbed Evelyn's arm. "We need to get out of here. Now?" Evelyn knew he was right. They had uncovered something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. And whatever it was, whatever had infected this bear, wasn't natural. They had come here searching for answers. But now, it felt like someone or something didn't want them to find the truth. Far from the frozen wasteland, where Evelyn and her team fought against the unknown, a storm raged over the North Atlantic, battering the hull of an icebreaker, cutting through the black water. A lone figure stood at the stern, gripping the railing as the wind whipped against his heavy parka. Dr. Marcus Bell had spent years stationed at the remote Arctic research facility, but tonight, as he stared at the encrypted message flashing across his satellite phone, he felt a cold deeper than anything the polar night could bring. The message was brief, nothing more than a string of coordinates and a single word beneath them: leave. He knew the coordinates well. They pointed directly to the site where Evelyn's team had landed just hours ago. His fingers hovered over the keypad, debating whether to respond, but he hesitated. Whoever had sent this didn't want a conversation. They wanted a warning to be heeded. The problem was, he had seen something like this before. Months earlier, long before this bear had appeared, before the barnacle infestation had turned their scientific certainty into chaos, Marcus had been contacted by an old colleague, Dr. Adrian Falk. Falk had once been a respected biologist, specializing in Arctic ecosystems, but he had disappeared from the field under mysterious circumstances. No one knew why. His research had been classified, his funding pulled, and when people asked questions, they were met with silence. But one night, out of nowhere, Falk had sent Marcus a desperate message. "If you find anything unusual, anything that doesn't belong, stop digging. It's not what you think." It never was. Marcus had dismissed it at the time, assuming Falk had fallen into the paranoia that isolation sometimes bred. But now, standing on the deck of a ship navigating the icy waters near Greenland, he wasn't so sure. He glanced back at the satellite phone, reading the message again. Leave. Something was wrong. He turned abruptly and hurried inside, his boots thudding against the metal floor, as he made his way to the research station's control room. The ship was carrying a small crew of scientists, all focused on different projects, but one of them, Dr. Helena Rourke, had been studying marine anomalies for years. If anyone had an answer for what was happening to that bear, it was her. He found her hunched over a monitor, analyzing deep sea footage from a recent dive. The screen flickered with grainy images of the ocean floor, vast and lifeless, until the camera caught sight of something strange, an abandoned submersible, its metal hull covered in a thick layer of barnacles. Marcus felt his stomach twist. Where was this taken? Helena barely looked up. Near Baffin Bay. We picked it up on sonar last week. Sent a remote drone to check it out. She tapped the screen. This thing's been down there a while, but the barnacle growth is unnatural. Too uniform. Too fast. Marcus leaned closer. The patterns of barnacle coverage on the sub looked eerily similar to the way they had infested the bear's body. His throat tightened. Did you send this to anyone? Helena finally turned to face him, her dark eyes sharp with suspicion. No. Why? Marcus hesitated. He could feel it now, the pressure, the weight of something bigger than them creeping in at the edges. The message on his phone. Falk's warning. The infected bear. And now this a derelict sub, covered in the same impossible growth. Pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit, yet somehow were part of the same picture. Send me the full analysis, he said, keeping his voice steady. And keep this quiet for now. Helena frowned but nodded. Marcus, what the hell is going on? He had no answer. Instead, he turned and left, his mind racing. He needed to get word to Evelyn before it was too late. Because if these barnacles weren't natural, if they weren't supposed to be here, then someone had put them here. And whoever they were watching. Somewhere, beneath the ice and water, the real threat was waiting. Evelyn's breath came in sharp bursts as she gripped the edge of her seat in the helicopter, her heart still hammering from what they had just seen. The barnacle on the bear had moved. It wasn't just a parasite, it was alive in a way that defied everything they understood. The way it had reacted to sound, the way it pulsed, as if sensing them, it had sent a visceral wave of fear through her, something raw and unshakable. But worse than that, someone had been watching them. And now they were gone. The Arctic had always been ruthless, but this was different. This was calculated, deliberate. Jonah sat across from her, staring blankly at his gloved hands as the helicopter roared through the frigid night. He hadn't spoken since they lifted off, and that silence unsettled her more than anything. Liam kept checking the thermal scanner, cycling through different imaging modes, as if trying to force the mysterious heat signature to reappear, but it was gone, vanished, without a trace. Evelyn swallowed hard, forcing her mind to focus. They had the bear. It was sedated, strapped down securely in the cargo area, but the weight of their discovery made it impossible to feel like they had won anything. Whatever had caused this wasn't an isolated phenomenon, and now a single, unshakable thought clawed at the edges of her mind. What if it wasn't just the bear? What if something had put these things here? A sudden jolt rocked the helicopter, snapping her out of her thoughts. The pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. "We've got a problem." Evelyn tensed. "What kind of problem?" "Communications are cutting out. I've been trying to reach the station for 10 minutes. No response." Her stomach lurched. The Arctic Research Station, where Marcus and the rest of the team were waiting, wasn't just their destination. It was their only safe haven in the middle of this frozen expanse. If something was wrong there, they had nowhere else to go. Liam frowned. That doesn't make sense. The station's comms are solid even in bad weather. The pilot didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, edged with unease. "There's more. We picked up a distress beacon for a few seconds, but it cut off before I could lock the signal." Evelyn's skin prickled. A distress beacon. Someone at the station had tried to send a call for help, but before the signal could even stabilize, it was gone. Cut off. Silenced. Jonah finally looked up, his expression grim. This isn't a coincidence. The helicopter surged forward through the night, the research station now just a few miles ahead. But Evelyn could already feel it, the shift in the air, the weight of something waiting for them. She reached for her radio, trying one more time. "Marcus, do you copy? This is Dr. Carter. We're inbound with the bear. What's going on out there?" Silence. She tried again. Nothing. And then, just as she was about to give up, a burst of static. Faint, garbled words crackled through, barely audible over the hum of the helicopter. "Not safe. They know. Get out." The signal cut. Evelyn's blood turned ice cold. Marcus's voice had been filled with something she had never heard from him before: panic. The station came into view, a small cluster of prefabricated buildings glowing faintly under the eerie green shimmer of the northern lights. But as they got closer, she realized something was wrong. The main floodlights that always illuminated the exterior were out. The place was dark, lifeless. Liam leaned forward, gripping the edge of his seat. "This doesn't feel right." The pilot circled once, scanning for any sign of movement, but the only thing below them was untouched snow and the skeletal remains of the ice runway. Evelyn's throat tightened. No one was coming to meet them. No one was outside. Something had happened here. Jonah cursed under his breath. "We shouldn't land." Evelyn hesitated. Every instinct told her to listen, to turn back, to put as much distance between them and this place as possible. But if Marcus and the others were still inside, still alive, they couldn't just leave them. "We don't have a choice," she said. "We need to find out what happened." The pilot hesitated, but began his descent. As the landing skids touched the ice, the helicopter shuddered slightly before settling. The rotors slowed, the deafening roar fading into eerie silence. Evelyn unstrapped herself and grabbed her gear, trying to steady her breathing. Liam powered up his thermal scanner again, sweeping it across the base. No heat signatures. No sign of life. Jonah stepped out first, scanning the darkened buildings. The station had always been their sanctuary, a place of knowledge and discovery. But now, it felt like a tomb. The wind howled through the empty corridors as they approached the main entrance. The heavy steel door was slightly ajar. Not forced open, left open, as if someone had either fled in a hurry or wanted them to walk inside. Evelyn clenched her jaw and stepped forward, pushing the door wider. Inside, the station was silent. Unnaturally so. The hum of generators was gone. The overhead lights flickered, casting ghostly shadows against the walls. Equipment lay scattered on the floor papers, overturned chairs, a broken radio still crackling with static. Something had happened here. Something violent. Jonah knelt by a fallen clipboard, picking it up with trembling fingers. Evelyn watched as his eyes flicked across the hastily scrawled notes, his expression shifting from confusion to horror. "Evelyn," he murmured, handing it to her. She took it, her hands clammy despite the cold. The handwriting was Marcus's, rushed and uneven, as if he had written it while running or in the throes of desperation. "It's spreading. Not just the bear. We were wrong. It's already here." A sharp bang echoed through the station, making them all freeze. The sound had come from deeper inside. Someone or something was still here with them. A cold dread settled deep in Evelyn's bones as she gripped the clipboard, her mind racing through the implications of Marcus's frantic warning. "It's already here." She had assumed they had all assumed that the infestation had begun with the bear, that it was some rare biological anomaly affecting Arctic wildlife. But if Marcus was right, if this thing was already inside the station before they even arrived, then everything they had believed about the situation was wrong. Terribly, dangerously wrong. Jonah's breathing was shallow as he slowly stepped away from the note, his eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway ahead. "That noise. Someone's still in here," he whispered, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. His other hand rested near the hunting knife strapped to his belt, a precaution none of them had expected to need in a place that was supposed to be safe. The word echoed in Evelyn's mind, reverberating through her bones like a silent command. Shoes. It wasn't a threat. It was a demand. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she turned back to Marcus, if it could even be called that anymore. His face, once familiar, was a twisted mask of something that no longer belonged to him. Beneath his skin, the shifting mass continued to undulate, pressing outward, searching, waiting. Jonah's grip on her arm was firm, his voice barely controlled. "We're not playing this game. We get out. Now." But Evelyn could see it, the understanding dawning in his eyes, the same horror that had sunk its claws into her chest. There was no getting out. Not without giving it what it wanted. Liam shook his head violently, his breath hitching. "No. No, this isn't happening. We don't even know what it means." But Evelyn did. She didn't know how, didn't know why, but the moment the word left that thing's lips, she had understood. It wasn't just here to kill them. It wanted something else. A decision. A sacrifice. Her mind raced back to the station's distress calls, the garbled logs that had cut off mid-sentence, the final desperate messages of the research team. Had they been given the same choice? Had they failed? The shadows in the hallway stretched, creeping along the floor, coiling like something alive. The walls groaned, the whisper of something slithering through the vents above them. And then, the worst sound of all, the heavy mechanical click of the station's main doors locking down. They weren't leaving. Not unless they chose. Marcus, or the thing that had taken his shape, took another shuddering step forward, his eyes impossibly dark. "One stays," he said, voice quiet, steady, almost gentle. "The others go." Liam's strangled breath was the only sound for a moment. Oh God! Evelyn's pulse slammed against her ribs. This was it. This was the test. The real mission. Not a rescue. Not containment. Command had sent them here knowing exactly what they would face. Knowing what the research team had discovered. Knowing what it would demand. One stays. The others go. Jonah's jaw was clenched so tight she thought he might break his teeth. Not happening. Marcus blinked, the movement slow, unnatural. "Then none of you leave." And just like that, the temperature in the corridor seemed to plummet. The shadows surged forward, reaching. The wet, fibrous substance on the ceiling pulsed. The station was breathing. It was alive. And it was done waiting. Evelyn's breath hitched. No, she wasn't going to die here. She wasn't going to let it win. She turned to Jonah, to Liam, forcing steel into her voice. "We have to make a decision." Jonah's head snapped toward her, disbelief flashing across his face. "You can't be serious." But she was. Because as much as every cell in her body screamed against it, she knew the truth. They weren't leaving unless one of them stayed behind. Evelyn didn't have an answer. But she knew that whatever she said next would change everything. Evelyn's heartbeat pounded like a war drum, her body frozen between fight and flight. But there was nowhere to run. The thing wearing Marcus's face stood in front of them, waiting. Behind them, something else was stirring in the shadows. And the voice, the real Marcus's voice, still crackled faintly through the radio, weaker this time, as if it were being swallowed by the very walls around them. She realized something with chilling certainty. There was no right choice. Her breath hitched as the emergency lights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows down the corridor. The walls groaned, as if the station itself was alive, shifting in anticipation of what came next. The air was thick with something she couldn't name, something ancient, something hungry. Jonah's grip tightened around his rifle, his jaw set in grim determination. "We need a plan. Now?" His voice was steady, but there was something in his eyes, something that said he knew just like she did that there was no plan that ended with them making it out of here the same way they came in. Liam was still staring at the thermal scanner, the screen a mess of movement, pulsing heat signatures that twisted and writhed like they were responding to something unseen. His hands trembled, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're everywhere." And she knew he wasn't just talking about the things in the hallway. It was in the vents, the walls, the air itself. It had been waiting for them, watching, and now it was awake. Vasquez's voice crackled through the intercom again, more urgent this time. "There's only one way out. But if you open that door, if you step outside, you need to understand what you're bringing with you." His tone was grim, like he already knew what choice they were about to make. And it wasn't the one he wanted. Evelyn's pulse pounded in her skull, her mind racing through the possibilities, through the things she remembered now, the things she had chosen to forget. The station had been a tomb, a place built not to house research, but to bury something. And she had been a part of that. She had locked it away once. And now, she had undone it. Jonah turned to her, his expression tight. "We don't have time, Ev." And he was right. The walls were shuddering, the shadows stretching, and somewhere behind them, deep in the darkness, something let out a low, rattling breath. It was moving now, fully awake, and they were out of time. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, her body screaming for her to run. But where? Back into the station that had become a living nightmare? Out into the frozen wasteland, where command was waiting to bury them? There was no right answer, only survival. And even that wasn't guaranteed. The intercom buzzed again, Vasquez's voice, the last thread of reason left. "Evelyn, listen to me. You can't let this spread." His words were firm, but there was something else in them now. Resignation. Like he knew she wouldn't listen. Like he had already seen how this would end. And maybe he had. Maybe she had too once. Jonah moved first, grabbing Liam by the arm and dragging him toward the reinforced exit. Evelyn hesitated for only a second before following, her heart hammering as the walls groaned behind her. The station wasn't just waking up, it was coming apart. The door loomed ahead, heavy, mechanical, their last chance at getting out. But what waited beyond it? Command, who had sent them here to die. The world, unprepared for what they had just unleashed. The first of the creatures reached the corridor behind them, the distorted shape of what had once been Marcus leading the charge. Its mouth curled into something almost human. "You shouldn't have come back." Evelyn slammed her hand against the control panel, her breath catching as the door's locks disengaged with a deafening hiss. She had made her choice. The door slid open, revealing the blinding white of the frozen wasteland beyond. And as the first tendrils of darkness slithered toward them, Evelyn stepped forward, knowing with a sinking certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. They weren't all getting out of here alive. Evelyn's breath burned in her lungs as she ran, the flickering emergency lights casting distorted shadows along the corridor walls. The station groaned around them, an unearthly hum vibrating through the floor, rattling her bones. The air itself felt thick, pulsing, alive. She didn't know how much of the station's structural integrity was failing, and how much was something else, something unnatural, something that had been waiting. The alarm shrieked, drowning out the rapid footsteps of Jonah and Liam at her heels. Behind them, the thing wearing Marcus's face remained eerily still, but Evelyn knew better than to trust that it wasn't following. They were out of time. The intercom crackled again, Vasquez's voice laced with urgency. "You need to reach the sublevel now. That's the only way out." Jonah's voice was raw, furious. "You expect us to trust you after everything." "I don't expect anything. But if you don't listen, you die here." Liam's grip on the thermal scanner was unsteady, his breath ragged. "Evelyn, there's too many of them." She didn't need to see the scanner to know. She could feel them now pressing in through the walls, slithering through the ventilation shafts, watching. The entire station had become a living thing, and it had finally turned its attention on them. And then, all at once, the lights cut out. The station was plunged into darkness. Evelyn staggered to a stop, her pulse hammering as her vision struggled to adjust. No, no, no. Then came the sound. A slow, wet dragging. A series of clicks, sharp, deliberate, inhuman. Liam whimpered. "Oh, God." Then it spoke. Evelyn. It wasn't Vasquez. It wasn't Marcus. It was everything. Every voice they had heard since stepping foot in this cursed station. The distorted echoes of the distress call, the static-laced warnings, the final garbled screams from the missing research team. They wove together into a single monstrous whisper that curled around her mind, like fingers pressing against her skull. "You are the key." Cold terror spiked through her veins. Jonah grabbed her arm, his voice a harsh whisper. "Don't listen to it. You brought it home." Her breath hitched. "What?" The emergency lights flared back to life in a sickly, pulsing red, and that was when she saw them. The figures, what was left of them, staggered toward them from the far end of the corridor. Their bodies were wrong, bones twisted at unnatural angles, skin rippling as if something writhed beneath the surface. Their eyes, if they could still be called eyes, were hollow pits of shifting darkness. They weren't just infected. They were becoming something else. And standing in front of them, between Evelyn and the only exit, was Marcus. Or rather, what was left of him. The shifting beneath his skin had settled now, the transformation complete. He looked human still, but Evelyn knew that was a lie. His head tilted slightly, his lips curling into something that almost resembled a smile. And then, "You should have never come back." Evelyn's stomach turned violently. Back. The word slammed into her like a bullet. This wasn't the first time. She had been here before. Memories she hadn't known were buried clawed their way to the surface flashes of the station. The research team, Vasquez staring at her with something close to pity. She had been part of this before. And she had forgotten. Her knees nearly buckled. "What did you do to me?" Marcus, or the thing inside Marcus, took a step forward, and behind him, the other creatures stirred in unison. "We didn't do anything," it murmured. "You did this to yourself." The intercom shrieked with feedback, and Vasquez's voice cut through, sharp and urgent. "Evelyn, MOVE." Jonah didn't wait. He yanked her forward just as Marcus lunged. They sprinted toward the sub-level access hatch, Liam fumbling wildly with the lock. Evelyn's mind reeled, horror clawing at her throat. She had been here before. She had known what this place was. And she had chosen to forget. The hatch gave way, and they plunged into the darkness below. The moment they hit the sub-level, the cold was suffocating, the air thick with something damp and metallic. The sound of footsteps above inhuman and erratic sent a fresh wave of panic through her. They didn't have long. A single floodlight flickered on at the far end of the corridor, illuminating a reinforced door. Vasquez's voice crackled through their radios. "That's your way out." Jonah didn't hesitate. He ran. But Evelyn didn't. Because something inside her whispered that she already knew what was behind that door. And she had a choice to make. Vasquez had told her they were never meant to leave. But Marcus, the real Marcus, had tried to warn her before he was taken. Don't trust it. But what if both of them were lying? What if the real threat wasn't the creatures? What if the real threat was her? Jonah reached the door, slamming his fist against the control panel. "Evelyn, we have to go." But her feet wouldn't move. Because the whispers in her mind weren't just voices anymore. They were memories. And the thing waiting on the other side of that door, the thing Vasquez was so desperate for them to reach, wasn't salvation. It was the reason she had forgotten. It was the reason she had come back. And then, as the creatures above began to pour through the hatch, Evelyn finally remembered. The real horror wasn't what was in this station. The real horror was what she had left behind in the world outside. And it was waiting for her to return. The world outside was too bright. The sky, an endless expanse of grey, seemed to stretch impossibly far above, too open, too exposed. The first breath Evelyn took as she stumbled into the cold, barren wasteland outside the station, burned in her lungs, thick with the weight of something she couldn't name. She was alive. But she didn't feel like she had survived. The heavy steel door groaned shut behind her, the mechanical lock sealing with a finality that sent a shudder through her bones. Jonah was beside her, bent over, hands braced on his knees, his breath ragged. Liam had collapsed into the snow, eyes wide and empty, staring at nothing. They had made it out. They had escaped. And yet, none of them moved. None of them celebrated. Because the truth sat between them, unspoken but undeniable. They had left something behind in there, and they had brought something back with them too. The wind howled across the frozen landscape, sending flurries of ice whipping around them. In the distance, the shape of their transport vehicle stood dark against the white, a silhouette of salvation that felt almost unreal now. The mission had been a lie, every step of the way. The rescue? A fabricated excuse. The distress call? A lure. The station had been a trap, but not just for them. No, it had been waiting for her all along. Evelyn pressed a trembling hand against her temple, her pulse hammering. The memories hadn't fully returned, but the weight of them pressed at the edges of her mind, threatening to break through. She had been here before. Not as a rescuer, not as a soldier, as something else. And Vasquez had known. That was why he had tried to stop her. That was why he had fought against command. Because she wasn't supposed to come back. Jonah's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. Tell me we did the right thing. His eyes, usually so sharp and sure, were full of something broken. Tell me we didn't just make everything worse. Evelyn's mouth opened, but no words came. Because she didn't know. The station had been locked down for a reason. Something unnatural had been inside. But the final moments, the whispers, the visions had made it clear. The real question wasn't what they had left in there. It was why she had forgotten in the first place. Liam let out a sharp, bitter laugh, hollow and humorless. They're never gonna let us leave, are they? His voice was barely a whisper, but the truth in it made the cold seem sharper. Evelyn knew he was right. Even if they reached the transport, even if they sent out a signal, command had never intended for them to come back. They were loose ends now, witnesses to something that was never meant to be seen. The station had been a prison. And if command had their way, this frozen wasteland would be their grave. The radio on Jonah's hip crackled to life, the sound making all three of them jolt. The signal was weak, broken by static, but the voice that came through was unmistakable. Evelyn. She went rigid. It wasn't Vasquez. It wasn't Marcus. It was herself. The blood drained from her face as the transmission played, warped and distant, like it had been recorded long ago. If you're hearing this, the voice was strained, desperate. Then you don't remember. But you have to listen to me. You have to stop this before it's too late. Liam's breath hitched. Jonah's fingers hovered over the radio, as if afraid to touch it. Evelyn's body felt like ice. The voice on the transmission, her own voice, let out a shaky breath before continuing. You were right to lock it away. You were right to bury it. But they found it again, didn't they? They sent you back. And now you've let it out. Her pulse thundered. Whatever happens next, the recording whispered, you cannot trust them. Not command. Not Vasquez. Not even yourself. Static swallowed the rest. The wind howled through the silence that followed, whipping around them, pulling at their suits, biting into their skin. Evelyn turned toward the station one last time, the darkened structure standing like a tomb against the endless white. And deep beneath the ice, something stirred.